Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk a bit about ESP, English for Specific Purposes. What is this? Well, when I was working for quite a while, many years in fact, in Japan, and I would ask my students why they were learning English. And they would often say things like that they were going to be tourists traveling abroad a lot, or like her, that they were learning English in order to work abroad and do international business meetings like she's at here, right? Students often say things like that, but that's often not what ends up happening for the majority of students, right? Yes, people do learn English because they plan to emigrate from their home country to an English-speaking, largely English-dominant country, or they are going abroad for an extended period of time to go to an English medium of instruction, EMI, English medium of instruction university, where they're going to be learning about business or history or whatever in English. They also sometimes go to English medium of instruction universities in their own country. For example, our partner Wyatt, Westminster International University in Tashkent, teaches in English, although the university is in Uzbekistan. They learn English for EOP, English for occupational purposes, and sometimes, of course, for tourism, right? But if you think about the amount of English you would need and the different content, topics that you need to talk about for these various purposes, right? I mean, think of tourism. Like, it always seemed disheartening in some way when students, I'd say, why are you learning English in Japan? Or I also lived and taught English in Korea for a year. And they'd say tourism. And I think, can this really be the purpose? You're spending several hours a week for many years of your life, primary school, junior high school as they call it there, right? They have 3 levels, and then maybe even in university, spending years of your life, hours each week learning English just so you can go abroad and speak English as a tourist. That can't be a useful, productive way to spend your time and your country's valuable educational budget just so you can go abroad and order lunch and buy some souvenirs, right? Someone learning English, well, to emigrate at the other end of the scale here will need to be able to talk about everything to everyone, right? They'll have to work in English presumably, and they'll shop in English, and they may have children that go to school eventually, and they'll have to interact with the school system in English and so on, right? There's a lot of reasons that people learn English, but most of them are not going to be immigrants to go to another country, right? And most of them probably won't be going to an English medium of instruction university abroad or in their home country. What probably is most common for people who live around the world and who exist day to day in their home language, not English, probably what's most common is that they will need English for just limited, specific purposes, right? The discussion of ESP is that, right? That we're going to teach people what they need to know. We're not going to have, as opposed to general English where we teach a bit of everything, with ESP, we're going to do as Hutchinson and Waters say here, we're going to make all of our decisions, what should we teach? Well, first we have to know why they're learning English. That's ESP. That in ESP, it's the teachers of the content or the employer or the language examination committees, that it's someone other than the language teacher that drives the language content, right? That's what ESP is. So what Stevens calls the absolute features of ESP, that may be too strong, but that's what they were called, right? What ESP must have is it's designed to meet specific needs, right? Learners have these purposes and therefore they need these words, these grammatical patterns, and so on, right? They need this, right? And the content, it will be what drives those topics, right? And in particular, it's, as it says here, the occupations or activities or disciplines. So discipline being a sort of the content, like if you need English because you are an international researcher in chemistry, right? Your occupation, your job, but even activity. I know people who are very interested in learning English because they loved to surf. And so they wanted to know how to talk about surfing and things that I don't really know about, but long boards and you know, how long does a board have to be long? They all look long to me, but that means something to a surfer. A Japanese surfer who wants to talk about the activity of surfing internationally when she or he travels abroad, or locally when he or she talks to tourists who come to surf. Japan has some good surfing. They need to know specific English for that specific activity. And therefore the language will be centered on everything to do with that activity or occupation or discipline. And that we need to know something about the activity as teachers in order to teach it properly. We need to know the underlying methodology and activities, right? We need to know what is it that those people do, what are their activities, and what is their methodology. Methodology, the study of method, the reason, right? The ology, study of method, right? So we need to know the reason that they do those things. So in order to be an effective ESP teacher, you really do need to know a lot about the purpose that your students are learning English for, and you need to know how they do things in their activity or occupation or discipline. So it demands a lot of knowledge, a lot of specialization from the teacher to do it effectively. What Stevens called the variable features, well, it may be restricted. You may only focus on certain things. One of the most spectacular in the sense that it's a spectacle, that it's highly visible, forms of ESP is called air speak, the language that international airline pilots use to speak to one another and to ground control. They have a very restricted amount of language that's acceptable. Even the way that you greet each other is controlled by the system, right? So you don't say, "Hi, how are you doing?" You say, "Hello," and so on. That may not be accurate. I don't know air speak, but I know that it's very restricted in terms of the vocabulary choices, very restricted in terms of the grammar, and so on. We don't really care about the methodology, like the how to teach ESP. Different teachers it may be done in a more content based way. It may be done with more language focus, right? It may be done more in a traditional grammar teaching way, grammar translation method. It may be done in a more communicative CLT, communicative language teaching method. That can depend more on the individual situation. That's not what's important when we're thinking about ESP. With ESP, we're just thinking about the fact that we have a specific purpose for the language and that's guiding everything else, all the other decisions. Primarily, we're probably thinking about adult learners because it would only be by that time that they would know why they wanted to learn English, right? For children, we probably think more about English as being a general thing, teach them a bit of everything, and then later when they specialize, they may move to a more ESP-oriented direction with their learning. Adult learners can be learning, of course, at university, but much ESP teaching is also done in work situations. Employers may bring teachers in to the workplace in order to teach their employees more, to improve their language skills so that they can interact with international customers or international people coming in who have to be talked to in English in the home country because they can't expect tourists or international visitors to know the language, right? ESP is generally designed for students of a higher level because, as I said before, you need a base as a young person would probably have some base that they'd learn through the general school system, and then they'd move on to the more nuanced, specific language of their discipline or activity or occupation once they have one. So we assume some basic knowledge of the language system. We can branch ESP out into, if we want to be more specific, EAP and EOP. EOP was mentioned earlier, English for occupational purposes, English for the workplace. EAP, English for academic purposes. For, like we said earlier, those students who are going from their home country to an English medium of instruction university in Britain, in America, Australia, or what have you, right? EAP could be further broken down. We won't go into this level of detail, but you may in your research come across terms like this, right? English for medicine or English for STEM, science, technology, right? English for occupational purposes, you may get down to English for vocational purposes or English for business. And you'll find that in any of these, the textbooks, the terminology, the teaching material is quite specialized. I first learned Japanese using a textbook that was quite good, but I wondered why at first it had a lot of words that for me weren't that useful, words like wrench or spanner and hammer and so on. And eventually someone told me, oh, because you're using a textbook that's designed for people who are learning Japanese for vocational purposes. A lot of people coming from other countries to Japan to work as builders in the labor force needed those kind of words. It didn't click for me until too late. I shouldn't tell you this. You may wonder if I should be here lecturing to you or not. But anyway, right, it didn't click for me that I was using a book designed for a specialist purpose as opposed to something that would probably have been better designed for me. ESP learners tend to be adults, as we said earlier, tend to be motivated to learn because they have that specific purpose. So this can be quite nice if you're used to teaching students who are taking English because they must. These are students who are often taking English because they want to. And even if it's because they must, because for example, they're doing it in an employer program, they may be motivated to learn because it will help with their chances of promotion, help with moving up through the hierarchy of the company. They're often very experienced in their field, the content, the ways and the methodology of their field. They just don't have the English language skills to describe that. But you don't want to make the terrible mistake of conflating someone's language ability with their general intelligence and their knowledge of their own particular field. Time is often a pressure in a way that it's not for school students, where they have allocated time to each subject. Often with people who are learning ESP, they're time pressured and they have to learn at the end of the day, after work, for example. And the interesting thing, despite what I said about them being motivated to learn, well, they're motivated to learn something because they want to progress through the company, but they may not necessarily be interested in English inherently, English specifically. They didn't choose to learn English because they like English. They're motivated to learn because they want to succeed in their role. If they have to learn English to do it, so be it. But it's not like teaching students who choose English because they have some affection for the language or affection for the countries where English is spoken, or because they want to travel internationally and so therefore English can be quite handy. So there's that tension between people who want to learn, want to succeed, not necessarily caring about English specifically. The ESP environment can be a classroom, of course, but company premises are often also possible. I used to go to a Japanese company and teach on site. Can be interesting as a teacher because unlike when students come to you in your classroom and you feel comfortable and they're coming onto your space, in this case, I would often feel uncomfortable because I was going onto their space and surrounded by people who were experts in that domain, in that company's domain. I was brought in as the language specialist, but I still felt, like I said, especially at first, felt uncomfortable because I was going out of my element to work in theirs. teaching is often done before the start of the workday or after the regular workday in the ESP environment. How do you know what to do to find those specific purposes, to find what language skills do they need to know more about speaking or writing, those particular vocabulary items and so on? How do you know what to do? In your research, you're bound to come across the term needs analysis. This is what you should focus on, right? What is a needs analysis? How do we do it? Well, the term is pretty self-evident, right? We want to analyze someone's needs and then develop a curriculum based on those needs. We go backwards, right? We think of this as starting from the back. Imagine people in a particular profession. So here are some nurses. We're going to start by thinking, what do nurses do? What tasks do they have to perform? With whom? So you might imagine, okay, well, nurses may have to interact with patients, they may have to interact with doctors, right? What sort of things do they do? Well, they might take down the information from the patient, take it down orally, listening, or take it down in written form if they ask questions and fill out a form, right? And then they may do a lot of reporting to doctors, right? He said that he said, direct or indirect reported speech, right? And so that can start to lead you to thinking about step 2, right? What skills are they using, right? What mode of communication? So by mode of communication, when we talk about mode, for most of us, we only have 2 modes, written and spoken mode, right? I say most of us. Some people have the 3rd mode. Can you think of a third? If there are 2 modes, written and spoken, what is the 3rd mode? Sign language, right? Some people, American Sign Language, British Sign Language. Some people have a 3rd mode can access that 3rd mode. I cannot, right? You need to know the mode of communication. So in the case of the nurses, speaking with patients, but also there'd be a lot of reliance on writing that other jobs may not have, right? But I know from experience, because my mother was a nurse, there's a lot of writing involved, right? But then they do need to speak too, right? You may have to summarize to the patient or summarize to the doctor something about what's happening, right? So there'd be a lot of spoken information too. Understanding the form. Important to know that just because filling in a form is not necessarily the same in all lingua cultures, right? Even things as simple as an address, things that we may think of as essential, as natural. You know, in Britain, we write a person's name. When you're filling out an address, you write their name, and then you move from smaller to bigger in terms of the address, right? Name, street, city, county, country, right? Some places, that's reversed, right? You start with the bigger elements, country, province or prefecture, city, neighborhood, name, right? So, there's nothing natural about that. So that's the kind of thing you'd want to think about in an ESP curriculum, and when it comes to designing one for nurses and thinking about form filling and so on, things that we may think of as natural. Forms are always this way, and it's just the language that's different. No, that's not the case, right? What language functions do we need to achieve these tasks? So you could imagine that these nurses would be doing a lot of asking for information, but also clarifying. Do you mean the pain is constant or just at certain times of day? Things like that, right? But they might have to do a lot of things that aren't to do with the immediate physical reactions to whatever the problem is, but also the emotional labor of trying to help someone through a difficult time. So they might need a lot of language to do with that say someone in a different job, an architect or something, wouldn't need. The form filling, I already said, right? The writing in the forms. And the reporting, this was one that was interesting to me when I looked at some ESP lessons for nurses. The reporting, there was a heavy emphasis on reporting doctors' words to patients, sometimes with direct speech, he said, and then give the exact speech. sometimes with reported speech. She said that, and then summarizing the doctor's words, not repeating them directly. And also changing the register, right? Changing the register. Register in language means something like using the right language at the right time, right? When you're greeting someone, to give a simple example, when you're greeting someone, you can do the same thing, greet, but in different registers. You can say, hi guys. You can say, hello everyone. You can say, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, right? Those seem to be that good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen would seem to suit a more formal situation. Hi guys would be a more friendly, informal situation, right? That's what's meant by register. Well, you can imagine that a nurse may have to change register when talking to different people, right? A doctor may use a term like myocardial infarction, whereas talking to the patient, you'd say heart attack. Doctors may use terms like hemorrhaging, which have specific meaning to do with bleeding internal of the body or blood coming out of the body. You may just say to that, a nurse may say that to a patient as internal or external bleeding in order to make it comprehensible. You don't want the person to feel stupid by using words they don't know, especially the first time, right? So there was a lot of talk about learning the different registers in the target language, in English, learning the different registers, what's appropriate for which situation. Finally, you get right down to the details. Then you've done all this, you get down to the details, and then you'd start to say, okay, what specific language do we need? Well, for grammar, we need to know about direct reported speech, he said, and then a quotation, or indirect reported speech, he said that, and then continue on. For vocabulary, we'd need to get down to those specifics of register, telling the patient that the doctor, she said that you have some hemorrhaging, doesn't sound right. She said that you have some external bleeding, and so on, like that, right? But it's only finally at that point when you're really making a detailed needs analysis, and I'm using the example of where you theorize about it. But of course, a true needs analysis, well, you'd start by talking to the nurses themselves. And then you'd end up with something like this, right? And this is how you would plan your curriculum after having done the proper needs analysis. So, something to consider. Choose a profession, whichever one you think might be most suitable for your future work as an English educator. And do what I just did with the example of nurses, right? Move through these steps of the needs analysis and try to plan just a couple of lessons, or maybe that's even too much, just a couple of topics with an example or two of language that you would do in order to teach an ESP lesson to those people. Good. Thank you very much. Bye.